Hello, welcome to episode 2 of Building Frame 007. This episode's going to be about creating the plugs and the subsequent moulds from them. I've got a lot of footage of the seat tube, so I'm just going to do it of this seat tube lug here, and then the rest will be very similar and just happened off camera for all you know. This is the plug as printed in those two parts I mentioned previously, and it's a bit rough off the printer, but it's the best I got. I could print it better, but it would take hours and hours and hours, so I print it, sort of find a nice balance. So I'll start off by just rough sanding it using the Dremel with the sanding drum to get off most of the bad bits. So here it is after that first sand, just knocking off any larger bits and trying to clean up the elephant's foot from the print and any lump from the bond joint there. And it also just keys it in a little bit for the next process, which is going to be putting some filler onto it. And for the filler, I'm just using normal car body filler, polyester based, so I can add some polyester resin to it. I'm using the moulding system polyester resin, which already has fillers and additives in it as well. But if you add a bit of it in and then just give an enormous amount of hardener, it all cures up nicely, but it just thins it out a lot more, lets it spread over the part better and gets into all the nooks and crannies. I recorded myself putting it on, but I managed to have it off camera, so here's just the finished result. It's a little rough, but it's hard when the bit, you can't actually put the piece down because I'm doing it on all sides, and it's body filler, it sands through easily enough. So there's a little look around of how it's going, and we'll turn it from this ugly duckling into a nice polished part soon. So I'll let that dry and cure off for a bit. And continue with the sanding. I start with 120 grit. It's a nice, good grit to get everything down. Eats through the filler pretty well, but doesn't leave nasty big gouges in it like the 60 or the 40 grit that I've got out there would. Yeah. So the mess you can see me progressively accumulating on my workbench here is various cylindrical items that I've found, used, or just whatever. and I'll wrap sandpaper around them sometimes to get some of the features in if my fingers are getting sore. I didn't end up using them that much on this part, but I like to have them out into hand so I'm not using the wrong shape. And I've got this tiny little sort of cylindrical bit on the end of my Dremel here to just cut in those sharp features, because I want them to have a nice crisp line in the mould, because it will just make everything nicer and stuff. So that bit's very nice for getting in there. It saves a lot of cramping fingers. So I was test fitting it there into the mould base, and you can see it on the right of the shot now, and that is what one side of the mould will look like. Obviously you may have seen other two-part moulds made in other videos or processes where they'll embed it in plasticine or clay or things like that, but to keep it all uniform and nice and know that I'm getting it exactly in the centre and not ending up with a nasty draft, I will print it out like that. And it doesn't have any indexing features on it, because it means then I can just block sand that flat to get a nice flat section. Then once I've done the first side of this mould and taken that initial plastic base off, I'll actually cut in the indexing features, and then when I create the second side of the mould they will pull those indexing features off. I hope that all adds up. But yeah. Just progressively test fitting it as I go as well, because this is a good indication as to whether I've left too much filler on or if I'm taking any bits off too much, because obviously I haven't changed the shape of the base at all, but I am sanding into the plug. So if I've just got a bit carried away, say, and taken a big bit off, there'll be a gap which I can hopefully spot. And test fits are just sensible anyway. You can see that little gooch bit going in there as well. And now it's on to the long process of wet sanding. I'm using a sort of fairly rigid foam sanding block here to try and alleviate any sort of pressure differences from my fingers on the sort of larger, more uniform sections, and hopefully just bring it all nice and smooth. I think I started with 120 probably, just wet sanding it with 120 because I've been dry sanding up until now. Then I move on to 240 grit, and between each grit I am wiping it clean and cleaning my hands just a little bit on a rag to ensure I'm not dragging any grits through, because otherwise you're just pushing around bits of 120 grit with your 240 grit and creating scratches. Pretty standard practice for wet sanding. Now I'll continue all the way up through the range to I think about 800 or 1000, and then I've got a little polishing compound which I'll use, which I did off camera again because I managed to take it out of shot. But here's the finished piece, all polished. It's not got a mirror shine on it, but it's enough, and I'm already about 6 hours deep into sanding this at this point, so I'm a bit fed up of it. But it's really, really nice and smooth, no deep gouges or scratches or anything, and it's going to produce a nice part. So now I'm going to start assembling the kind of plug and base section ready to pour this mould into. And PLA as a material for making moulds from is not the best because it can't take any heat. It's a pain to sand and nothing sticks to it. You can't put paint on it. Body filler barely sticks to it, and gluing bits together is a nightmare. But it does release very well from epoxy, so you can actually be fairly relaxed with how much you wax it. I usually just do a couple of coats of wax on, wax off, leave them to settle in for 15 or 20 minutes, grab my lunch or something, and then I'll come back and progressively do coats while I set up a few other bits. So I'm also filleting it with filleting wax, just to seal it in, because the pourable resin stuff that I'm going to use will sneak in behind there and cause all manner of problems, potentially either lift it up, cause air bubbles, all these sorts of things, and it just allows me to cut a nice fine line into everything. So I'm pushing it all in with the little ball tool, and I'll come around with this sort of sharp-ish edge, but not too sharp that I risk scratching anything, and just sort of whiz it all off and just leave that really fine line inside the tiny little gap. Once it's all filleting waxed, I will release wax it as well, and that will just clean up any remaining bits of wax that are left on the surface and hopefully finalise this assembly. So there's the completed mould box. I've put the walls on the outside of it and filleted them in as well. Not particularly neatly because it's hard to get in there once it's all like that. But again, that stops any leakage or any risk of the pourable resin escaping out of there. Now I'm going to start prepping to pour it, and I don't have any disposable mixing buckets that are big enough, so 4 cups it is. And I've done my maths here, and this is where the models of everything come in useful in the CAD. The volume of it is around half a litre, and the density from the data sheet is about 1.7, so I've called it 1.8 to get nigh on a kilo of resin, which is 900 grams of resin with 50 grams of hardener, made into 4 cups, it's around about that. So that's a really sort of high estimate from the data sheets of this resin, assuming it's 1.8. I think the data sheet said it was 1.7 or so when mixed. But even then, as you'll see later on in this clip, it still wasn't enough. So either, I know the walls on my mould are taller than they need to be, so maybe I got misled by it, but it still seemed, and then with all the other moulds I poured, it still seemed that my maths were never quite enough for it. So yeah, you think this pourable mould stuff's going to be really economical and great, but then you end up using like 20% more on every single pour. It does eat into my sort of estimates of the cost. But yeah, giving it a really good stir, then pouring it from a height to try and eliminate all the bubbles, and trying to pour it into the bottom of the part, or the lowest section of the part, so everything rolls around. Standard kind of pouring practice. And then leaving the cup I've just poured to drain out. And I must say it does sort of come together really well and pour really nicely considering how thick it is. It's absolutely exhausting to mix by hand, and I think if I were to do anything much bigger than this, I would probably buy bigger mixing buckets and probably make a little attachment for the drill and just mix it with the drill. So here's me pouring that little bit extra, as I say. And here's the completed moulds. Here's the indexing that I was talking about earlier. I tried a couple of different ways of making the indexing happen for the various moulds I made for this frame, and this is the one I'm least the fan of, to be honest with you. But it's fun to try things. And this pourable resin stuff, it, as you can see, is taken a really good reproduction of the surface I've created, but we've already got a pretty gnarly chip down there in that corner, just from removing the plastic, which is a bit annoying because I didn't realise, I'd hoped this would be a little less brittle than it's ended up being. But yeah, hope you've enjoyed that little run through. Here's a picture of all the moulds in their various states of being. The seat tube mould half done, the bottom bracket mould just getting a polish, and the dropout mould just waiting to be laid up. I hope you're enjoying this video series. My editing and videography skills are pretty mediocre. My workshop is quaint, but I'm sure if you like and subscribe at all, then more will come and it can get less quaint. Thanks for watching.